Asato ma sadagamaya tamaso maham jyoti gamaya mrityormam amritam gamaya avir avir maedhi rudrayate dakshinam mukha te namaham payanityam. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Reach us through and through ourselves, and evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. So my subject this morning is speech karma. And let's get right into it. Karma means self-conscious, volitional, free will, human action. And every such action has a moral valence, and therefore it's governed by the law of karma. That law is a universal, natural law corresponding to physical laws, such as the law of causation and Newton's third law of motion, of action and reaction. The doer of karma is the jivatma, that is the ego, under the veil of spiritual ignorance, who identifies with the mind and the body and the mind and the senses. And every act of karma has two effects. One is direct and immediate, the other is indirect and roundabout. The first effect changes our character, our personality and our character immediately. The second is an indirect, goes out and around and circles around in the universe and returns to us like a boomerang in the course of time. And maybe you can think of a game of billiards. If you're practiced with playing pool with a pool cue, you line up that cue and you make your shot. And in so doing, you reinforce your skills immediately. Either you're a better or worse player for that very shot. But in addition, that ball is now rolling around on the table. It hits all the others, and all of the billiard balls reconfigure themselves in a way that will be beneficial or maybe not so beneficial for the rest of your game. Now, there are three kinds of karma: thought, speech, and action. And we don't often think of speech as a karmic action, and yet it certainly is, because we use the vak indriya, that is the organ of speech, and well, for every speech act, there is a belief and a desire and an intention, and a prior intention and an action, and a bodily movement. The whole cycle of what is called an action. And it fits in very well with thought karma, speech and action, because to think is just to speak low. And our activities just express our thoughts, and we do what we said that we are going to do. So every speech act is governed by the law of karma. If we do good, then good will return to us. Similarly, if we do something which is against the great laws of dharma, then things will happen that are not beneficial in our life. Now this morning, let's begin here. We're going to begin by doing a personal inventory of our speech acts. Let's say that you took everything that you ever said in your life, and you had been recorded maybe, and we put all those recordings, every sentence that you ever said, you put it into a big barrel, and it's going to be like a barrel of apples, and we're going to sort them out. And we're going to use a system, an ancient system, which devised by the Sankhya philosophers. It's called the doctrine of the three gunas: sattva, rajas, and tamas. The red, the white, and the black. So let's roll all those apples out on the floor, and we can divide them up. Some of them are no good. They're all rotten. Some of them are very good and ready to be sold in the store. Others are somewhere in between. So let's begin by looking here at the first category of speech acts. And it's called tamasic speech. The noun here, we're going to give you a few Sanskrit words. The noun tamas just means darkness. And it's aligned with in the five elements, it's aligned with the element of earth. You think of clod of earth as being heavy, characterized by inertia. The adjective here is tamasic, tamasika. We use an Indo-European IC ending in English, so we call it tamasic. And that just means any action which is characterized by dark ignorance. Now, what kind of speech acts are those that we could kind of list? Well, certainly we have to begin with anything which is untruthful and which is against the fundamental truth condition of human speech, that is, in order to communicate, and that means in order to think, we have to assume that we mean what we say. And so untruthfulness has got to be first, of the untruthful has to be the first there of the tamasic speech acts. Certainly those which are illegal, like perjury or slander, or defamation of character. In addition, we can talk here about those kinds of tamasic speech acts that are, we could call them harmful speech. You know, the first, John Stuart Mill, the father of liberal Western democracy, he has one rule: you're free to do whatever you want, only do no harm. That's the no harm principle. Do no harm. That means sometimes we say things which are hurtful, which are hate speech, which are name calling. Sometimes we speak in anger and we hurt the feelings of others. This was true of a boy who often used to speak in such a way, and he'd lost all of his friends. And so he came one day to his father, who happened to be a carpenter. And he told him his problem, and the father reached over and he picked up a bag of nails. And he said, "I'll tell you what, why don't you go about your business today, and whenever you lose your temper and you say something that you regret, I want you to take one of these nails, hammer it into the fence." There was a wooden fence in their backyard. Or they hammer one nail into one of those posts, which he did. And that day, he hammered 3 nails that day. And the next day he hammered another 3 nails. And time passed, though, it became kind of tiresome. Uh, and soon the number of nails that he was hammering grew fewer and fewer. He got to 2, to 1. A couple of days passed. He thought, well, I seem to have overcome my problem. He returned to his father, told his father. His father said, very good. Now I want you to go out and see how long you can maintain. Now you formed a good habit. Let's see how long you can maintain it. And for every day that you maintain it, you pull out 1 nail from one of the posts. And so the boy went out. I'm sure the first day it was okay. He pulled out a nail. Second day, a nail. Time passed till he had pulled out all of the nails. And he returned to his father. He said, Father, I think I'm established here in this a good habit. Father said, yes, very good. Let's go out and look here at the fence. They walked out in the back. There they looked at that fence. But once a time, it was a very beautiful wooden fence. And the father said, you see, let's see now all those holes in the fence. Similarly, it is with all your past speech acts, that all those harmful, hurtful things you said, they left scars. And even though the nails have been pulled, the scars still remain. So that's the second kind of speech, tamasic speech. Very hurtful to others. Now we can think about other things. We can think here about common swearing, things like profanity and obscenity and vulgarity. Profanity just means taking the Lord's name in vain. That is, taking something which is grand and holy and treating it with disrespect. Blasphemy, taking something which is big and which is great and treating it with indifference and contempt. See, the psychology is that everything in the world has a logos and it has a telos. That means it has a purpose. And just as you have your tools in your toolbox, you learn very early age, you treat your tools as you don't abuse your tools. You don't misuse your tools. That would be improper. Similarly, everything ought to be treated in according with its telos. That is, it should be treated in the way that it deserves to be treated. And if you treat it otherwise, you are doing an injustice. An injustice, well, that's the law of karma. That's the great law of justice. And the effects go around and come around. So we have profanity, we have blasphemy, we have obscenities. Think about in the English language, there's 1,500,000 words in English. And out of that, all of those words, it so happens just a handful of those 4-letter words seem to have surfaced, and you hear them every day in common parlance. And some people say, well, it's a sign of social decadence. It's a sign of the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, the yogis don't say that. But they do say and point out to us that there is a reason why this is called tamasic speech. That's because there is, in spiritual life, is a battle between the spirit and the flesh. Now, by flesh here, we don't mean the flesh and blood body. St. Paul, what he means is the desires that come and arise from that part of ourselves which is not in alignment with the great laws of dharma. And therefore the spirit and the flesh cannot be together. You can't have both together. Ram and Shyam can't live in the same house, because pretty soon, as independent people, because pretty soon they're going to get married, they're going to have children, and they're going to merge into one. So similarly in spiritual life, that's obscenity. So what do we have? Oh, we have profanity, we have blasphemy, we have obscenity, we have vulgarity. Vulgarity just means that you use barnyard language when you are not in the barnyard. That means, like, say you're a farmer, and you come into the city, and you come in, and you're gonna dine with your citified friends. Then you certainly would not use such language. That is, you change your clothes, and you would change your register of your speech also. Why? Because it would be impolite. It would be in bad taste to use that barnyard language. And as students of Vedanta, we know, well, when we speak about taste, that's so fundamental. That's the fundamental first prerequisite of spiritual life. That we have viveka, that means discrimination. Discrimination means you have good taste. Of course, the yogis are talking about discriminating between good and evil, between the real and the unreal, but it's the same principle holds true. How you select your clothes, how you select your food, it all is part of the same thing. And therefore we observe the principle. Tamasic speech. Another kind of tamasic speech we can think of. We can think of how often it happens when our neighbors make a lot of noise. Maybe you go to the window and you mutter some curses. Well, students of the mantra shastra, when they hear about that, then that becomes very serious. Because, well, you may say, well, I didn't mean it, but it doesn't matter. Words have meanings. Words have a vibration. And muttering such curses, that's called black magic. It has its effect. It goes out and it comes around. It gives it lowers the vibration. See, this is all spiritual life. We can say our what we are, that is our body and our mind, is nothing but an energy field. In spiritual life, we have the spirit, the soul, we have our consciousness, and then we have that energy field. Spiritual life, we don't have to do anything to the consciousness. That's already perfect. But what we have to do is upgrade that energy level from the lowest, that is from 0, maybe up to 1,000. You go from 0 to 1,000, and certainly speaking in anger and hate and jealousy and pride, those are all down like below 100 on the scale. They're prompted by thoughts and emotions associated with those speech acts. So that's just common cursing. Now we're talking about tamasic speech acts. We can also add into this kind of moaning and groaning and complaining about the difficulties of life. You know, in Vedanta, one of the first prerequisites before you're even allowed to begin to study the Vedanta philosophy, you have to have certain qualities. One of those qualities is called titiksha. That's called forbearance. That means that we've learned to bear and forbear with the ordinary difficulties of life without complaining. That's a virtue. And it seems very basic. There was once a young man who came to join a Trappist monastery. And he had his interview with the abbot. And the abbot said, yes, you go there. We're going to be observing silence here in this monastery. You can't speak, you can't say anything, but you can come back again in 5 years and speak to me. And so the new monk went off. Time passed, year after year. Finally, 5 years was up. He came for an interview with the abbot. The abbot said, well, my boy, how are you doing? And he said, the food is very bad. Oh, said the abbot, yeah, well, that's okay. You just go back and you continue on your practice. And so the boy went back and he continued his spiritual practice and didn't say a word. 5 years, time passed, 1, 2, 3, 4. 5th year, returned to the abbot. How are you doing, my boy? And he said, the bed is very hard. Oh, said the abbot, that's okay. You come back and you just go back and continue on with your spiritual practice. So he went back, time passed, year after year. Finally, in 5 years, he come back, he returned again. The abbot said, well, now how are you doing now? What do you have to say? And the monk said, I quit. And the abbot looked at him and he said, well, I'm not surprised. All you've been doing is complaining anyway. Well, that was the standards of the abbot of the monastery. The point being, the tamasic speech is like junk food. Junk food, that is food that's fatty and that's deep fried and it's sugary and it's too sweet. It does mean things to our body. Similarly, it is with the tamasic speech. Now let's look here at another category. We look here. Let's call it rajasic speech. The word rajas here just means, we're talking about tamas, is associated with the element of the earth. Rajas just means energy, matter and energy. Means energy. The adjective here is rajasic. Rajasic is those things which are associated with the elements of fire and of rushing water and of strong wind. Sometimes rajas is translated as dust. And we can imagine that a wind is blowing and the dust is swirling all around and it's just total, everything is in a mess that we're kind of confused. And maybe that dust storm may remind us of our own mind. That is of what the yogis call the monkey mind. The monkey mind is all confused. It's like a monkey. It's just so active. That is, he's so amped up with energy. He just can't control himself. That's just by his very nature. But it may be that one day he's stung by a bee. Now his antics are much worse. And then he drinks a bottle of wine. Now he's just reeling and he can't even stand still at all. And then a demon enters into him. He's even much worse. And then someone makes him dance on a hot plate. Can you imagine how crazy that monkey is? That's our own, according to the yogic perspective. The perspective of the yogis, that's the nature of the ordinary mind. And the rajasic person is sometimes called by philosophers and religious philosophers, sometimes called typical of the worldly person. The worldly person is the favorite straw man of Vedanta. Worldly person is the guy who's just that is the ego, that is the false self, identified with the lower mind and the senses, the person who is externalized, the person who is materialistic and who rides the roller coaster of success and failure. That is, sounds a lot like ourselves. It's ourselves before the awakening of spiritual consciousness. Before that, this is characteristic of our mind, the rajasic mind, the mind of the worldly man, characterized by rajas, that is by activity, by uncontrolled energy, and out of the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. And therefore, rajasic speech, the content of rajasic speech is always secular. That is to say, because the senses are turned outwards, and because the Rajasic mind is occupied with the worldly things, that's what it speaks of. That's the content of the speech. Rarely talks about anything to do with soul, God, and religion. But if they do happen to venture some opinions, people will find that is pretty much sounds like empty speech, empty talk. Sri Ramakrishna tells about the boy. His name was Pogo. Lived in a village. He was lazy, mischievous. And while all the villagers were working in the fields, he just would fool around. One day he wandered off, and he wandered up the nearby hill, and he came to an old dilapidated Shiva temple. And it had been abandoned for years. The image had been removed. But Pogo went up there and was looking around, went inside, saw everything was covered with dust, and there were roots of a banyan tree growing up through the floor and everything. He was looking around, fooling around. He came outside and he saw there was the temple bell. Bell means it's like a gong. It's like a heavy metal disc that's hanging there. And he picked up a big stick and he began to sound that temple bell. And sure, the villagers down in the fields, they heard that gong. They thought, well, what is that? That's a church bell. Well, maybe a holy man has come. Maybe he's come and reinstalled the image of Shiva. Oh, let's go there. They got up themselves, put their tools aside, got themselves all cleaned up, and together they all wended their way up the hill. By the time they got there, everything looked the same. Looked like the same old temple. They went in, they found dust everywhere. Nothing had changed. Then they realized they saw their Pogo, that mischievous boy, and then how they chastised him, saying that why did you ring this temple bell? You see, it's all, you make an empty sound. There's nothing you have, there's no image of God which has been installed here at all. Rajasic speech. Empty talk. It's talk that's rushing. We have the element of rushing water. Water is rushing and flowing. It's swiftly. We can't hardly cross over the stream. And it's talk, speaking without thinking. Now, the rule here is the old proverb, as you say, is think twice before you speak once. Because it's easy to speak. Just say anything. We remember that famous letter that was written by Mark Twain. You know, Mark Twain is like the river. So I compare it with the river because his name, in order for the river boats, that is the flat boats, to move along the Mississippi River, it has to be 6 fathoms deep, 6 feet deep. And a fathom is like 3 feet. So it's 2 fathoms. That's where his name came from, Mark Twain. 2 fathoms deep for the boat to flow. So he was a riverboat guy. But he wrote the letter. Once in his collected letters, there's a letter that goes on about 5 pages. And at the end of the letter, he says, I apologize for writing you such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a shorter one. Well, that was the idea. You see, you have to think. It takes time to think and organize your thoughts to write a shorter one. It's easy to just blah, blah, and write that long letter. And it reminds us of that thing, the incident there happened long ago in Pennsylvania, 1863. And the dean of Harvard University, his name was Edward Everett. He came and he was the featured speaker on that memorial occasion in Pennsylvania. And he spoke at that time, that it used to be that as part of the traveling entertainment was orators who tour the country. And it was expected that they would speak for a long, because you didn't get your money's worth. If they spoke for an hour, he spoke for 2 or 3 hours. Well, Edward Everett spoke for more than 2 hours there in the hot sun. And he finally finished, sat down, And then the guest, he was not the featured speaker, but he was the honored guest. He got up and he delivered his speech, which was 2 minutes long. That's the Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln. We still remember that sattvic, those sattvic words, every word carefully chosen as indicative of speech. So sometimes we find in our lives that as yogis, as students of spiritual life, even as we look back in retrospect on our day, maybe we can see that we remember that we talked on and on about some trivial matters, you see, of little concern, wasted our time, maybe got involved in some political argument that just went nowhere. At the end of the day, we kind of regret that in the interest of time management and in streamlining your life, that we kind of regret that time that we wasted in what the yogis call rajasic speech. Now, the opposite of rajasic speech is, we could say, what can we do about it? Well, one thing we could do about it is just to say nothing. That is, we could practice. The Sanskrit is called mauna. That means silence. Taking a vow of silence and not speaking at all. And if you read the lives of the saints, you know that where there was a guy who came here long ago, this was back in the 1930s. He was one of the earliest of the Indian saints and avatars and holy men to come to America. His name was Meher Baba. Maybe you've heard his name. He was a contemporary in the early days of Mahatma Gandhi, and he had a big following, and he got from Bombay, had a huge following in India of hundreds of thousands of people, but he came here on a boat and eventually ended up in Hollywood, and he made friends with many of the famous movie stars there at the end of the 1930s. But for 43 years, he practiced silence. That's what he's known. He was known as the Mauni Sadhu. Carried a little board that was a little letter board with him, and he traveled with an interpreter who would kind of speak for him, but he never spoke. Just as an example of an early guy who actually kind of, Mahatma Gandhi also, we know, if you read in his autobiography, Experiments of Truth, you know how he, on every Monday, he wouldn't speak. And even in the midst of the political campaigns, he would write maybe on something important, he would write it on a piece of paper, but he never would speak on a Mondays. Now, in the Vedanta tradition, the teachers don't recommend this practice of extreme silence. For one thing, it's a form of asceticism. And Vedanta doesn't teach asceticism. And for one thing, it's virtually very difficult, impossible to do in any reasonable sort of way. See, once there were 4 Zen Buddhist monks, they're young monks, and they decided to take a vow of silence for 1 month. They vowed they were going to say nothing. They weren't going to speak a word. And in order to start their silence period, they sat together quietly in the meditation hall and they began to meditate. And a little time passed, and one of them opened his eyes a little bit, and he saw the lamp burning in the meditation hall, and he said, "The oil in the lamp is running low." And the second monk opened his eyes and he said, "You just said something. We're not supposed to talk." And the third one said, "You two are talking. We're not supposed to say anything." And the fourth one said, I'm the only one who hasn't said anything. So you see, all four of them, within such a short time, that's the end of their vow of silence. That's why the yogis don't recommend that we practice extreme abstinence, but rather that we practice perfect moderation. That's the great middle path. Now let's look here at the third kind of karma yoga. Kind of karma yoga speech with regard to speech, and that's sattvic speech. Tamasic, rajasic, sattvic. The body, the mind, and the spirit. Sattva here, sattva is it's an important word in Vedanta. S-A-T, sat is the Sanskrit word. It means three things. It means reality, it means truth, and it means goodness. So it's got everything together. We could say sattvic. Sattvic is the adjective. Sattvic means spiritual. And sattvic speech is spiritual. The speech of a spiritual person. Now, such a person, we can look first at the content of his speech. Compared with a rajasic and tamasic person, the content is very clear. That is, the sattvic person always talks about soul, God, and religion. And, well, he can speak politely about anything, but the natural inclination of his mind, his natural interest, you know how we talk to anybody, within a minute or so, they're going to go to their natural interest. So your natural interest of the yogi is in spiritual matters. Sri Ramakrishna says that the God attracts the mind like a magnet attracts iron. We don't feel attracted to God. Why? Because the iron is buried deep in the mud, and the mud is all caked around it. It can't even move. What we have to do is get the iron out of the mud, wash off the mud. Then the mind is naturally attracted towards God. Similarly, it is the mind of the sattvic person is naturally attracted towards those subjects, and that will be the content of the default content of his speech. Now let's look at some of the characteristics of sattvic speech, which you can find in the Bhagavad Gita in the 17th chapter, 15th verse, where it talks about the austerity of speech. Now, austerity is different from asceticism. Austerity just means self-discipline. And there are certain characteristics of sattvic speech that are discussed in some detail by the commentators on this short verse. But the qualities of the sattvic speech are three in number. That is, they're truthful, pleasant, and beneficial. Let's look at the first one here. The word here is sat, satyam, truthfulness. Truth is a very big word in Vedanta. Truth is capital truth with a capital T. There is an ultimate truth. There is one ultimate absolute truth. So truthfulness is the first in the list of all the moral and spiritual virtues. The greatest example, the paragon of the truthfulness, of course, is Sri Ramakrishna, who practiced not only honesty, but veracity, integrity, truthfulness, all the different synonyms that we can have for truth-telling. We can see examples in the life of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna was a paragon there of integrity. Integrity just means manasyekam, vachasyekam, karman eka mahatmanam. That's the definition of a Mahatma, like Mahatma Gandhi. The definition of a Mahatma is a person whose speech, whose mind, whose speech, and whose actions, that is, whose behavior, are all the same. Everything is in alignment. And with the Sat within us, that is the truth within us. This is an important concept in Indian tradition. Every Indian piece of Indian currency, every rupee note will have written on it, Satyam Eva Jayate, quotation from the Mundaka Upanishad. Truth alone triumphs, not untruth. Truth alone lies the path of the Devayana, the path of the gods. So truthfulness, first characteristic of sattvic speech. So the second characteristic is called priya. That means it's pleasant. Holy Mother says once, telling debates about truth. Well, what if she said, don't tell it, always tell the truth, but don't tell a harsh truth. Don't tell a hurtful. Observe the no harm principle. And that sometimes it's difficult for us to do. And once there was a Maharaja who got into his head because he wanted to have his horoscope cast. And so he had a famous astrologer came into the court, and he began to do his calculations. And he noted the sun sign and the moon sign and the position of the planets. And then he looks through the big Sanskrit books and started doing all the mathematics. And he calculated the horoscope and his prediction. And then he came to the king and he said, well, Your Majesty, I'm sorry to tell you this, but according to your horoscope, you are going to personally perform the funeral ceremonies of all the members of your family and most of your friends. And the Maharaja, when he heard that, well, he loved his family. He loved his friends. And he was so vexed, he was so angry, he just threw that astrologer into the dungeon. Called bring another astrologer here. So they brought another astrologer came. He was given all the information, computed the sun sign, the moon sign, and the position of the planets, did all the mathematics from the Sanskrit books, and he came to the same conclusion. But he knew what had happened to that previous astrologer. And so he thought, and he said, well, Your Majesty, according to your horoscope, you are going to live an extraordinary, very long, long life. You're going to outlive all your family and all your friends. And the king thought, oh, really? Long life? That's very good. Thank you very much. And rewarded him fully. So you see how that second astrologer, he had a little diplomacy, we could call it. Priya, it's called pleasant. He said the same thing. He basically told him the same information, but he said it in a way that was more pleasing, that was pleasant. Satya, Priya, and the last word, Hita. There's a few Sanskrit words. We don't need these words to throw them into our vocabulary. Means third word here means beneficial. That is, everything that the sattvic person says is beneficial to others and to the world. How is that? You think, well, how is that possible? And the idea behind it is that in karma yoga, before you can begin karma yoga, it assumes that you're doing your dharma. That's the position. That's your starting point. You're established in doing your dharma. That is, you are a good person. You may not be spiritual. You may not be doing yoga practice or have a guru or anything, but at least you are a dharmic person. That means you're doing your dharma. You, of course, this is determined by your varnashrama and your all the different qualifications. And if you're doing your dharma, automatically, what is your dharma? Your dharma is that which an individual does that is the proper behavior, and just like the body and the whole, but just as in the body, all of each one of our organs and our hands and feet, everything performs its natural telos, its natural action, and so it's beneficial to the whole body. Similarly, it is the person who is the good man, not necessarily the yogi, but the good man is already doing his dharma. If he's doing his dharma, if he's doing his natural duty, then what he does in the day, everything that he does in the day, in the course of doing his duty, is beneficial to the corpus of all of the body of humanity. Similarly, it is when we begin to do karma yoga, assuming we practice doing our dharma. Karma yoga also, therefore, builds on that fundamental first premise. The dharma becomes karma yoga, and then we begin to. So sattvic speech is by definition beneficial to the whole. And therefore, one of the motto of this tradition, this Ramakrishna order, is Atmano Mokshartam Jagadhitaya Cha. Use the word hita. It's the word hita there means beneficial, and that means what is your motto in spiritual life? That is to do whatever you're doing for your own liberation and for the good of the world. So it takes a little meditation, a contemplation for us to think about what that means. So that's kind of a good subject for contemplation. So that's sattvic speech. You can read more about it by the commentators in the Bhagavad Gita. And so we have tamasic speech, we have rajasic speech, and sattvic speech, characterized by the three gunas, the red, the white, and the black. So this is karma. Self-conscious, your volitional, free will action. Every action that you do. Thought karma, speech karma, and your physical behavior. This morning we talked in particular, we zeroed in on speech karma in particular. It's something that we often neglect in spiritual life, and it would be good for us to be mindful of our speech acts. And in doing so, we can begin to make progress in our practice of karma yoga. Okay? Good. Maybe we'll save questions for later, huh? Good.
Are there any questions? Let's see. Anybody have a question that they'd like to ask?
Okay.
Okay, just
Good
one
question.
second, just wait for the microphone.
Yes.
Right.
The question is, what is the element for sattva?
What is the what?
Element or elements? I think you mentioned fire and water.
Oh, yeah. Well, we could say ether. That is the rarefied ether. Yeah, that's what you get when you get up beyond the atmosphere and the troposphere and the stratosphere and the ionosphere. You get up into rarefied space.